Bienvenidos.
Awesome.
Welcome. All
How are you
right.
going?
Doing well. Where are you joining?
Sorry?
Where are you joining us from?
Brisbane, Australia. I just wanted to say I've actually
Wow.
been a fan of your content for a while. We don't agree on everything, but I
Sure.
really enjoy the way that you put points across and the personality you
Wow.
bring. I think that you're definitely someone that brings a lot of positivity to the world in general. So
I,
yeah,
Thank you, man. I appreciate that.
I'm an atheist myself, but
Okay.
I was actually kind of wondering, like for yourself, what it is that you find convinces you of the existence of God.
Hmm.
Or I can say Allah if you prefer. I say
Sure.
Allah,
No,
I
no,
don't
no,
really
no,
mind,
God.
but
No, God. God is absolutely God. Huh? It's not whatever name we call him by. So, right. If I was to say the defining thing
Mhm.
that really um, that makes that gives me a sense of certainty that God exists, it is truly consciousness.
Right.
I feel that you see the profundity of consciousness, it transcends not only any understanding but any simple materialness of this world. And if that exists, to me, it definitely guides us back to the transcendent, to the divine.
Mm.
Yeah,
So
because
it's
it's not, you see, because it's so profound. Just, it's like we are. It's like the lights are on. Yeah, it's
yeah,
like we are online.
yeah,
It's like animals are like all. Let's say, because I suppose consciousness can be a kind of spectrum. So there's obviously there's awareness. It's difficult to also, it's like one of those things like love. It's difficult to kind of absolutely pin down, but we know what we're talking about, but it's difficult to always put into words. Now there's some kind of consciousness, if we're saying an awareness, a reflexivity, at a plant level, at within nature, and then animal kingdom, and it's kind of rising, but then it comes to a point where it's all of a sudden it's like it's online. And I like that analogy that some people use for it, this online offline kind of metaphor. And so and it's just something so I mean, I get it. It doesn't have to lead someone to God necessarily, but I feel it's difficult not to, if one follows the path of consciousness.
yeah. No, I
Mm.
can kind of understand that view. Like it's like consciousness is something which is very different to everything else.
Yeah.
um, so,
Tell
but
me about
uh,
it is something, and yeah.
if we did have like a fairly good understanding of how consciousness can
Mhm.
arise, like materialistically, though, do you think that would be something that would sway you in your views, or is it maybe something that is uh, maybe deeper or more important than consciousness, or it
You
like
see, you see, you see this thing that if we did have something that is, let's say, this question, if we did have a more detailed explanation of consciousness,
yeah,
you see, I it's not that if we did have, because I am, you see, to me it's a certainty, like it's almost a certainty, I could say, that this consciousness is not, it's, I understand what, if we could explain how it happens, you see, but that would be the whole thing in and of itself, because that the kind of offset to that question is coming from a perspective that, to me, it's kind of missing the grandeur of life. It wouldn't
mm,
be that way. You would never be able to explain it in that way, because to me, and I feel that many physicists may be exploring this direction as well, especially Bernard Carr is, and I mean he's was an associate of Stephen Hawking's, and that consciousness is actually within the cosmos, and that it's perhaps what joins, he feels, M theory with the multiverse theory, that the missing M being mind, that according to string theory, you see, even gravitation, I mean, gravity, as posited by string theorists, it's something that is possibly going through dimensions. Hence, it's such a weak force, because the weak force of gravity is still quite inexplicable. Like, we can't understand exactly why gravity is a weak force. And one explanation.
Do you mean a weak force within this dimension, or do you mean a weak force? Like, do you mean that it goes,
because it is actually
through
quite
dimensions because it's a weak force, or because it's go through multiple dimensions, it's a weak force within this dimension?
That is the response, or the hypothesis of many string theorists, that it's possibly a weak force because it's coming through diverse dimensions to us.
I see. Yeah.
But even when you're looking at how we understand reality, so you're just looking at reality, yeah, as physics, science, as hard science understands it. So it understands it in this sense that there are at least 10, if not 11 dimensions to existence, which obviously we just can't understand already, because it just, it's already like, what the hell does that even mean? And then what we're saying is, well, at the essence of everything is most likely, I mean, it's just vibration. Yeah, it's just vibration of just being. We don't know. Obviously, we're calling it a string, let's say, but it's just this vibration, which is then giving rise to something, which is giving rise to some subatomic particle, which is giving rise to matter, and so on. And obviously, the whole, Higgs field, and then so on, all these different particles. But what we are saying, in essence, from physics, is that you, me, everything, for the most part, is just empty space.
Yeah.
Now that, you see, even that, it's something like none of us would really ever believe in that if it wasn't just a given statement in science, because it sounds so absurd. So I feel that from an intuitive perspective, even not even from an intuitive, but even really, like, it's just because we know it to be true. Otherwise, we would really struggle to accept that really everything is, for the most part, just empty space. It's nothingness. And I feel that, in that is a humbling truth, that this nothingness is something, that this is that if a person can accept that, as they can on this level, it guides to, well, wow, this profundity of it guides to the transcendent. Because even with life, you see, life now, obviously, one of the, the elephant in the room is that life is obviously with DNA, but DNA is information, and thereby its very essence requires the intelligibility of being, which obviously I mean, because how
is kind of like, because DNA is like, it's kind of information. Like, it's not like the same sort of information as, like it is information, but it's kind of like let's say water was flowing down a mountain, right? And as it's flowing down, it's coming across certain resistances as it flows down the mountain. And so eventually that flow of water will create a path, or a stream as it goes down, and that's kind of similar to DNA in the way that it's
because the DNA is advising on how the proteins should be constructed. So it's actually dictating, it's informing the RNA, and it's informing it's actual information on what to do and what proteins to synthesize, which will then result in what kind of blocks. So it's not just it's not about an obstacle, it's an actual dictation. It's saying, do this. So this is, it's coding. it's in essence, it's coding. So it's coding of any nature, whether it's, you know, coding on a computer, it's software in essence. Now, there could be very simple software, very basic coding at a very primordial sense of life, or there could be very complex coding, life as we know it today. But that's, I'm not saying that this then, but I'm not saying a person has to see that and think, okay, there must be a God, you know. What I'm saying is, yes, it definitely brings that question, like the elephant in the room, that, wait a minute, if there is information, if the bit precedes the it, right, as it's been put forward, as it's been posited in the theory, that the bit does seem to precede the it, because it then dictates how the it is to be formed. So in that case, being with a capital B has intelligibility to it. And this is obviously the whole thing of Tilak, speaking of the fact that being has intelligibility of it, is indicative that there is, you know, that this is coming in with intelligence. Now, I understand it's not, you know, it's not like it's not to say, well, you know, there will still be faith. There will always be faith. It's not to say, well, this is, you know, once a person hears this, they can only say, you know, anybody who says off, you can only go one way or the other. It's no, it's always be a question of faith. Yeah, but I do feel that coming back to that, also that voice, you know, building of consciousness, that voice within, these things are ultimately what guide people to this way, or to the path of, you know, leads in search of the divine. It's usually from one being aware, that consciousness, and then from that, this voice within us, because there is this kind of voice that we find within us, and it's just too real to be just random and meaningless.
So from within, and I'm not sure if this would be maybe your view, but like from the Islamic perspective, like obviously we can all see that there's a lot of different religions around the world. And people from within those different faiths are going to have the same sort of inner voice that leads them in the guidance for their own religion. So is that more so maybe like because I know from the Islamic perspective, they believe that that God sent messengers across the world. So do you think maybe that would be like, again, from the Islamic perspective, with the Quran being the completely unaltered version, like of the wordings from God, would that then maybe make the other religions essentially the older
messages, or the very
messages?
So I mean, Islam generally, I mean, there's obviously there's as many interpretations as people, but many scholars always write, as the Quran states itself, that look, that there's been there's always been these prophets that have come to people, and they always come to a people that they are native to. And then God mentions some examples in the Quran, says we've only mentioned a few examples. There's so many, we have not mentioned them, but there's been people in all times that have come. Now, so yes, so I mean, that's so many people have said that, look, for example, Buddha, would have been a prophet, according to Islamic teachings, that he would have been a prophet, as Zarathustra would have been a prophet, or let's say Socrates was a prophet. These kind of discussions have happened on many occasions in the Islamic literature in the past. Obviously, these people have long been, I mean, they're, historical figures. So people are saying, well, when we look at their messages, this is what we see. We feel that would have been a divine. Well, how people followed it and how it turned out obviously is something that is up for debate, but they would feel that these people were divinely. Some people would, I'm sure some people would say that, no, we don't think so, maybe not. But there's always been that room to say, well, look, God has, that there's always been prophets of God that have been inspired in different places and have and then spoken to their people. The issue of religion, that there's so many different religions that you ask, of course.
Yeah.
Now this is really the human journey. You
Yeah.
see, it's not God's. This is, they will always be, you see, as human beings, it's not just human beings, it's nature. There will always be conflict. There will always be some kind of antagonism, some kind of competition for life in and of itself to thrive. Even with ideas, they must compete for them to thrive. This is, it's at every scale. It's at the human level, it's at life, just life in nature, and it's at an ideological level with ideas as well, with concepts. That there's always this kind of, that just seems to be the law of things. So yes, people will say, well, oh, but religions disagree in themselves. I would feel that in essence, many religions ultimately, in essence, the kind of core of them, the nectar of them, would be saying very similar things. Obviously, the kind of layers around them become different. And that may be in part with culture, maybe in part with where they are in the world and what they. So, for example, some religions, one of the key divergence that you study in philosophy of religion is it's either what they call, some have termed it Eastern religions versus Western religions. Some call it, you could simply call it the Abrahamic faiths, or but then it doesn't contrast it with something. So the East-West that is often given is those religions that relied upon reason, to like, they definitely embodied reason. Whether they always followed it through is a question for debate, but they at least asserted that they were built on reason. Now, versus those that were built entirely on the absurd, and by absurd I don't mean something being silly, but the concept of the philosophical absurd, that it was never about making sense. It was about just the experiential, and it was never to make sense. So things like that would be Buddhism, Hinduism, that kind of that group of beliefs, where it will say things like, things are not what they seem, nor are they otherwise. Now that in and of itself, even though you've understood the words, but what am I even saying? It's
speaking on multiple levels.
Exactly. And it's about embracing that philosophical absurd. And it's not about reason. So even from this split, it's about maybe what civilizations needed at a certain time. You see, I would feel that the ancient civilizations in the Far East, that they, at a certain time, it was about the mystique. It was purely about that, the philosophical absurd. But what happens is humanity is at a certain point in human history to be where religion is to be rooted in reason. And this obviously begins with the whole Judeo-Christian and then Islamic traditions that then set humanity onto a trajectory for unification. Because I definitely feel that the three greatest things that have set humanity on to this unification trajectory have been, as Yuval Harari highlights, that they've been, it has been religion, it has been empire, and it has been currency. These things have ultimately kind of unified humanity, and maybe we're heading towards a greater unity yet. In time to come.
Do you think with the inner voice you were speaking of before, and with the other religions potentially all having levels of inspiration, like I guess even when it comes to, though, considering like from people who are similar to myself, who don't hold an active belief in any gods or spirituality, like I guess that probably, I don't know your view, but maybe that wouldn't be exclusionary to having the inner voice, but then that would likely preclude the inner voice being from having the messenger and would just be like, I'm just trying to guess from your view, would be that's just a sign of
I'm saying that
God there or
these
something.
are, you see, there are many things along this journey that, you know, this journey of life. There are many things that will be, that are symbols of the transcendent, of the divine. Now, they may be there as an aid. They may be there to guide. They may be there and maybe ignored. So for example, an inner voice. For example, creation in and of itself, as Immanuel Kant would say, you know, the starry heavens above or the moral code within. Whether it's going to be consciousness, whether it's going to be other intricacies. So, for example, the question that mathematicians have raised, that it's interesting that you see, is this world a simulation? That you know, in the simulation theory, that what they've said, that okay, is it? If so, let's work it backwards. That if it were to be a simulation, what would you expect to find? Like, what could you catch out? Now, according to that hypothesis, the things that they would expect, they seem to be finding. And hence so they seem to be finding because you'd expect certain coding in the cosmos and certain forces to behave in a certain way and certain mathematical patterns to be in certain things. And they seem to be finding, I mean, you could just watch several, I mean, Neil deGrasse Tyson has a lot of panel conferences on it. They're on YouTube with mathematicians giving lengthy kind of presentations on it. So if you can watch that. In fact, everybody should watch it. It's very interesting. So you see, there are many signs or symbols. I would say symbols. I prefer that word, or signs, or whatever. And they're all there. And maybe some help others more than others. Maybe some don't help at all. Maybe but one thing for sure, it is a very personal journey. To some people, through things like mindfulness, through exploration, they have experienced certain planes and of consciousness that are undeniable to them. You know, some people through other measures have experienced that. Whether it's, in fact, there's a documentary. I'll speak about it on maybe next week. Through some of the sacred medicines, for example, things. There's a documentary called 5-MeO, the movie. And even though the documentary isn't necessarily, it's not hyping, it's just a documentary about 3 friends who set off to explore this, and it's just following their journey, but it's not necessarily speaking in favor of sacred medicines such as these psychedelics like 5-MeO, but it's at the same time, it's not negating it, it's just kind of leaving it for the viewer. Now, it's very interesting that these ancient traditions as well, that go back thousands of years, as with other traditions that have done this through meditation or mindfulness, or within the Muslim tradition as well, certain people with dhikr and this kind of, you see, it's interesting because dhikr can mean uttering, remembering, but it can also mean mindful, this mindfulness, and that people, they actually experience, and what they experience is, obviously it's subjective, but you see, it's more real than real. And for that person, it becomes impossible to deny what they have experienced. And I know to the other that they haven't experienced it. So they see that, you know, well, this is just your experience. You could be hallucinating. You could be this, you could be that. And true, that's to the other until they taste it.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, yeah.
Do you think though, if people are having these different experiences, like, is that, like, I understand how convincing it is to the person who has the experience, but a lot of the experiences people have are very different to one another. Like, there's not that level of consistency of, you know, what they went through, which
why would we seek out? You see, we shouldn't be. It is all about the individual person and their journey. It is not to mirror or to replicate or to clone another. I mean, obviously you have pathways, you will have structures, you will have societies, you will have, you know, you will have faith guidelines, you will have religions that are guiding you, but your experience is your very own, and it's for yours to cherish.
Yeah, I definitely agree that, like, I mean, if everyone was just having the same experience, it would be less of a special thing to do. But like the reason I
No,
asked that though is like
yeah,
for like generally in at least well, most of the world these days generally follows the scientific method for
yeah,
coming to terms with what is an accurate description of how reality works. And
yeah.
so when we
But
look
I,
at having,
but I've given that, and we don't really truly believe in it in our real world, but we believe in it in a textbook version. See, like I told you, you and I are for the most part not even here. And
yeah,
you see
the
now,
parts of us
really
that are here are
speaking,
completely here though. Like
and that's
the parts that make us
consciousness,
up. Well,
which once
I
again
don't
we
know.
have no idea where to begin with.
Yeah, I think though if we were to construct uh, say an actual replica of a human, right? Um, with fully functioning cells and all of that, I imagine that more than likely that person would be conscious if we were to ensure it was like a living creation, right?
Well, I can
Because
tell you, look, scientifically speaking, that wouldn't be true. You know how? Because Homo sapiens have long existed before the cognitive revolution. The exact same Homo sapiens as us. I don't mean Neanderthals or Heidelbergensis or these other variants. I'm speaking about Homo sapiens have
yeah,
gone back. So the ancient, so now we have at least Homo sapien findings from at least 300,000 years in certain parts of the world, whereas we know that the cognitive revolution of consciousness must have taken place anything between 70 to 100,000 years. So if you were to find a dead body of a Homo sapien from, let's say, 150,000 years ago, he would look identical to let's say, given whatever the regional features of a human being today. You would not, like, let's say we clothed him, you would think that is an absolute, you wouldn't think he's a Neanderthal. You wouldn't have like a protruding brow or anything. He would look
yeah.
exactly like us. So, and he would have a brain just like ours, the same capacity, the same CC, whether it's 1800 or whatever. He would be exactly like us, except he would not have consciousness.
So what is it that you mean by consciousness then? Like when you
Now,
say
isn't that the $1,000,000 question?
yeah, well, I don't really know what differentiates us from like a dolphin or an octopus, for
Yeah.
example, or any of the other apes. We seem to have varying degrees of
See, Matt,
functionality in our brain, but
that is where your journey begins, not just yours, each and all. And this is why I've said that in this day and age, it will be the path of consciousness that guides to the transcendent. In just trying to understand it, just try to spend the coming whatever time you have in the future, ponder, reflect that what is consciousness? Why is it special? What is, hominins have existed for so long. They're not just, and in fact, consciousness to a great extent is counter evolution. I mean, it's counterproductive, evolutionarily speaking. You see, because we are much better at survival based on instincts than we are on consciousness. Because consciousness causes you to pause. Whereas instinct, an animal will hunt on instinct. This is why it does what it does. It will hunt on how it's been built to hunt. If it had to think, you see, thinking weakens you because it can make you also think compassionately. It can make you slow you down. It can make you're not impulsively acting on instinct always. So it's not productive to evolution. Obviously, human beings have thrived because of consciousness, but it's not productive as far as evolution is concerned. Now, it just happens to be that, yes, we have taken it this way,
yeah,
but that's like a fluke. It's not
but I don't.
going by the, yeah.
I definitely like challenge you on that because instinct alone doesn't seem to be what we
Okay.
observe in nature.
Well,
Like
here, like
the,
all you'd
the
have to do to prove that, you just have to put a human being that is conscious in the wilderness on his own, and you'd have to put an animal. And you can place your bets, and I'll bet so much more money. Whatever you bet, I'll double it. and that the animal will outlive and outsurvive the human being. If he's on an island, brutal nature, you place a human being and you place on a similar virtual thing, let's say a chimpanzee, or you place an animal. Now, the animal will outsurvive the human because it doesn't, you see, the consciousness will freak the hell out of you. It will give you so much panic. You see, it's not, when you're built to just move and survive, that is all you're built for. You do not pause and reflect. And you see, as Mark Twain said, that I've been through many terrible things in my life, some of which actually happened. Most of our fears are in there. Our fears are kind of our conscious, like we imagine them. People live in depression. Why? In studies done on primates that, for example, chimpanzees who are paralyzed don't undergo depression. They don't become depressed. They live just as happy. Why would a human being in that scenario become depressed? Because of consciousness. Because he becomes conscious and he thinks of the future. And he thinks that, well, I'm going to live a miserable life. I won't be able to do what that. Whereas the chimpanzee in the studies with bonobos, they showed that there was no varying degree to their subjective well-being. They remain just as happy and they remain just as playful and joyous, regardless of becoming crippled. You see, human beings, when you say, does consciousness in brutal nature, the fact that society, you see, the way it's happened is it's won. Consciousness has won the war and humans have thrived. Now, you and I are living in that society where humans have thrived. So therefore, it's true, we would now think consciousness, but given if you're just playing a game of chance, you see, nature is brutal.
Do you know the marshmallow experiment that they perform on children to see, to basically demonstrate their ability for foresight and suppressing the desire for something now so that they can get something?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So would you say that
it's good that you mentioned that, because do you know the studies showed that bonobo chimps, when given the same study, withheld for the same amount of time as children, which was the maximum 18 minutes. Now they showed that bonobo had could exercise the same amount of self-restraint as a child could to refrain for a greater reward, but not longer than 18 minutes. However, the bonobo outsmarted the child when it came to mirroring on certain things. So for example, when they gave them, there were certain experiments where the child had to do something and they would get certain rewards, and sometimes it was randomized and you couldn't see how it was happening, but some had transparent kind of backing, so you could see the hand of the experimenter doing something. So you could tell, oh, he's doing this, so this is not going to happen this time, because you could see the hand. The bonobos, when they could see the hand, they recognized it. And they could tell that, oh, this isn't going to happen, whereas the child still couldn't. So the bonobo chimpanzees could outperform the intelligence of a young human child. But it's only as we develop that we become obviously much more intricate and sophisticated.
Yeah. But do you think that would be based on instinct then? Because if it's performed outside of the, normally I would say instinct would generally be something for you, it would be described as something which creates an impulse to act.
Right. Yeah. So just to, that's a good question, just to kind of as a notation to clarify that. So although I'm using the word instinct because I don't, for lack of a better term, that's just me. I don't mean by just purely impulsive instincts. What I mean is, you see, the animals have a brain as well. So they have all these kind of systems. They have flight, fight. They have obviously the sensory, motor sensory cortex. They have all these visual cortex. They have all the auditory cortex. They have these things as well. And obviously chimpanzees, similar to some extent to humans, obviously not as developed in the prefrontal cortex, but still similar. Now, it's not, I don't mean by that they're just surviving based on a whim, that it's just like an instinct to react. Obviously, there are some deep mechanisms. So even primates and animals and even certain mammals have some concept of justice, for example, and morals. And this, Franz de Waal speaks about this in his book, The Bonobo and the Atheist. He highlights after decades of studies that, look, they have certain structures and they have a community concern, and they recognize structures, they recognize hierarchies, they also recognize some form of right and wrong. They recognize punishments, and they recognize these things. There's obviously a sophisticated kind of mechanism at play, but they're not, and so obviously they are conscious. If it depends how, if we're speaking about consciousness as a spectrum, then they are conscious, but they're not. You see, we are at a point where we are online.
Yeah.
And they
so
are
it's a
still
degree of
offline.
consciousness rather
But
than just the
you see, it's just that
consciousness.
no, it's just that consciousness. When we're using it in binary terms to say we have consciousness and animals don't, we're not using it in that sense, in the spectrum sense, because it's like, obviously, life. So when we speak of life, obviously bacteria has life, but we're not speaking, when people say, for example, life is precious, they're not in that particular context referring to bacteria or viruses or things like this that are also alive, but they're referring to, let's say, human life, or maybe mammal life, or they're not even referring to reptilians or pests, or so yes, in one sense, life is, it's a continuum starting right down from single cells all the way up.
Yeah.
But when we're speaking in a certain setting, we're speaking. So when I'm saying consciousness, I'm speaking about consciousness as we recognize it, the precious, the question mark consciousness. But you're right, if we're speaking as a spectrum of awareness and some form of consciousness, then a lower level consciousness is there amongst animals, and more so amongst some than others, like obviously dolphins and elephants and obviously primates and even crows, to some extent. So it is there, but it's still a very qualitatively different format. It's not like how we have it. So we have obviously there's some kind of, if I can say, magic, there's some kind of magical level, makeover to human consciousness, which is very different. Now, that's what I meant. I wasn't just speaking about sheer instincts, that the animals are just kind of reactionary. But what I was saying is, you see, if the purpose of evolution is to survive, simply survive, then nature, which is brutal, can survive much better without consciousness being like our sense of consciousness, the magical consciousness being gifted, because nature is very brutal. To be wired to survive is just the better way to do it. With humans, consciousness, obviously we thrived in a totally different way, but I'm just saying, given the equation, it seems counterproductive to survival in brutal nature. Obviously, the way history worked out is humans did thrive. But yeah, I mean, these are obviously, to be fair, we can never settle these in just a discussion, but these are definitely fabulous points to ponder over. And it's obviously, look, it's a question which nobody can, I could say, I've experienced something that somebody else could say, they've experienced the presence of God. They've experienced these things. Now, I get it. To that person, it's, well, they've experienced this thing. And so it's more real than real. Somebody else could say, well, I haven't, and in my mind, that's just, it's subjective to you. Which okay, is each person's journey. For all we know, for example, one could argue that none of you really exist. This is all just a dream in which you are just a figment of my imagination.
Yeah.
And you could say, well, that's not true because I exist, but you could just exist within that imagination.
Yeah,
I mean,
you wouldn't be able to demonstrate.
You wouldn't be able to tell, exactly. No, it's been epic, Matt. I love the philosophical. What is it you do, by the way, if you don't mind me asking?
At the moment, I'm a student. I used to run a couple of businesses, but some not so great things happened, and I decided for a career change. So,
maybe for much greater things to happen yet.
Quite possibly.
Allah,
yeah,
absolutely. So,
Matt,
I
really appreciate.
I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate the dialogue. Take care, and I'm sure we'll speak soon. Stay in touch. Much love.
Yeah, thanks
Over and
again,
out.
and thanks for
You're
the
welcome.
positivity you bring across. Yeah, I see when you post the shorts on the
Thank
YouTube.
you. I appreciate
I
that.
always click them to have a look. So yeah,
Thank you.
and sorry to hear. I know it was a while ago now, but sorry to hear about the
Oh,
when the people came and did the
yeah.
house and
You
all
know,
that
it's
sort of
all
stuff. I was
even crises have within them hidden blessings, and many a
yeah.
blessing emerged following that. So thank you once again. I appreciate it. Take very good care of yourself, and we'll speak soon.
Yeah,
People,
my
ladies
pleasure.
and
All the best.
gentlemen, that was Matt from Down Under. All right.